As you watch these videos and listen to the sounds of war contained within this video, think about how the soldiers felt as they were under fire and consider the sacrifices they made so that you can watch this video and choose what TV you watch, what games you play, what cars you drive, what school you attend, what you read, and where you live. Following this video, you will be able to touch, smell, and feel many of the items you see in these videos. Please pay attention and learn a lot. World War I began on July 28, 1914, and was the first war that involved nations from all around the world, 28 to be exact, and is commonly called the Great War or the War to End All Wars. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, in Sarajevo. Exactly 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Because of a series of treaties or contracts between countries, Europe was immediately divided into two armed camps. On one side was the Triple Alliance, made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and on the other side was the Triple Entity, made up of France, Russia, and Great Britain. As other countries began to join sides, the Triple Alliance became known as the Central Powers, and the Triple Entity became the Allied Forces. Most of the fighting took place in deep trenches dug into the ground by hand in a zigzag pattern to protect soldiers from advancing enemies. Soldiers spent on average 8 days at a time in a trench, where they were constantly under threat of attack from gas, shell fire, snipers, and diseases. Soldiers experienced everything from trench fever, a painful infection caused by lice poop, to trench foot, which caused a fungal foot infection that could result in amputation. World War I was different from previous wars because soldiers used new motor-powered weapons which had never been used before, such as machine guns, artillery, tanks, and airplanes. Eventually, after over 4 deadly years and major battles in Ypres, Vimy Ridge, Somme, and Gallipoli, 38 million people had died and propelled the Allied forces to victory. On October 3, 1918, Germany requested a ceasefire. The war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, when the warring parties signed the armistice and agreed to stop fighting. World War II was the most devastating war in history because it included the most countries and killed the most people in the history of the world. It began in 1939 as a European conflict but quickly escalated into a global fight. With the end of World War I came peace and bitter resentment. The Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that officially ended World War I, required Germany to take full responsibility for causing the war and strip them of their land and military forces. Out of this anger and dissatisfaction rose a man named Adolf Hitler, the Führer, of the National Socialist Nazi Party, who promised to overturn the treaty, restore order to their nation, and preach that Germans were a superior race. In 1937, Germany signed the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo Axis powers with Italy and Japan, which was an agreement to help each other during wars. 2 years later, on September 1, 1939, the Second World War began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. After the Axis powers declared war, the United States did not want to get involved in another European war. However, they joined the Allied forces, which consisted of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, France, and China, after Japan attacked the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941. The war was fought on 3 fronts, 2 in Europe and 1 in the Pacific. On the European fronts, previous to the U.S. involvement, Germany used innovative and ingenious military tactics to take possession of all of Europe except for England, and was readying an invasion force when the U.S. began to send troops and equipment to stop the aggression. On June 6, 1944, the United States led the largest invasion force in the history of the world, known as D-Day, to take back Normandy, France, followed by a rapid advance and many bloody battles as they moved toward Berlin, Germany. On May 9, 1945, Germany surrendered. Imperial Japan allied with Germany and fought the war in the Pacific. Japan used well-trained forces to conquer China and most of the islands in the Pacific. They continued to invade and take possession of more territory until August 7, 1942, when the U.S. Marines pushed back in the first Allied offensive in the Pacific at Guadalcanal, which takes more than 3 months. The U.S. continues to push the Japanese back toward Japan on land and sea in horrific and bloody battles including New Guinea, the Philippines, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and many more. In order to save the lives of an estimated 1 million U.S. soldiers and 3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians, the U.S. dropped 2 nuclear bombs. The first on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the second on Nagasaki on August 9th. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, and World War II officially comes to an end. At least 70 million people lost their lives, about 24 million soldiers and 50 million civilians. In order to prevent another devastating war from occurring again, The United Nations was founded to prevent conflicts between countries. In 1910, Japan officially took control of Korea and held it until the end of World War II. After World War II, it fell to the United States and the Soviet Union to decide what should be done with Japan's possessions. In August 1945, two young aides at the State Department divided the Korean peninsula in half along the 38th parallel. The Russians occupied the area north of the line, and the United States occupied the area to its south. By the end of 1949, two new states had formed on the Korean peninsula. In the south, the anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee, who had the reluctant support of the United States government, and in the north, the communist dictator Kim Il-sung, enjoyed the slightly more enthusiastic support of the Soviet Union. Neither dictator was content to remain on his side of the 30th parallel, and border skirmishes were common. By July 1951, U.S. troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. The United States did not want communism to continue to grow, moving out of the Soviet Union and China into other parts of Asia and the Pacific, so they defended South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur insisted that the only solution to the Korean War was complete victory, forcing the North Korean government to secede defeat. Through several well-planned and executed tactics and cold-bloody battles, the U.S. took much of the northern part of Korea and some of China. Taking ground close to China was a mistake and caused the Chinese to send large numbers of troops to push the U.S. forces back south of the 38th parallel. For 3 years, the fighting went back and forth across the 38th parallel, with casualties mounting, while officials worked anxiously to fashion some sort of armistice with North Korea. The alternative, they feared, would be a wider war with Russia and China, or even, as some warned, World War III. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the Korean War came to an end as an armistice was signed by both sides. In all, approximately 5 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives during the war, including over 50,000 U.S. soldiers. The Korean peninsula is still divided today by a 2-mile-wide neutral zone. From 1945 to 1954, the Vietnamese waged an anti-colonial war against France, who eventually lost in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was followed by a peace conference in Geneva, Switzerland. As a result of the conference, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam received their independence, and Vietnam was temporarily divided between an anti-communist South and communist North. In 1956, South Vietnam, with the backing of the United States, refused to hold unification elections to combine South and North Vietnam. By 1958, communist-led guerrillas known as the Viet Cong began to have military conflict with the South Vietnamese government. To support the South's government, the United States sent in 2,000 military advisors, a number that grew to 16,300 by 1963. The Viet Cong continued to advance, taking control of some of the best farming ground in Vietnam. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the commencement of airstrikes on North Vietnam and committed ground forces which numbered 536,000 by 1968. In 1970, President Nixon attempted to slow the flow of North Vietnamese soldiers and supplies into South Vietnam by sending U.S. forces to destroy communist supply bases in Cambodia, which did not work. From 1968 to 1973, efforts were made to end the conflict through diplomacy. In January 1973, an agreement was reached. U.S. forces were withdrawn from Vietnam, and most U.S. prisoners of war were released. In April 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to Communist North Vietnam. The Vietnam War resulted in nearly 60,000 U.S. soldier deaths, 350,000 serious injuries, and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese deaths. Today, many Americans still ask whether the U.S. efforts in Vietnam were necessary, was a noble cause, an idealistic idea, or just a failed effort to protect the South Vietnamese from a totalitarian government. No matter what we think, we need to support and thank the soldiers who put their lives on the line to try and protect freedom. The Persian Gulf War, also called the Gulf War, was triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990. Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, ordered the invasion and occupation of Kuwait with the apparent aim of acquiring the nation's large oil reserves, canceling a large debt Iraq owed Kuwait, and expanding Iraqi power in the region. On November 29, the UN Security Council authorized the use of force against Iraq if it did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. By January 1991, the Allied coalition against Iraq had reached a strength of 700,000 troops, including 540,000 U.S. personnel and small numbers of British, French, Egyptians, Saudis, Syrians, and several other national contingents. The Allied coalition's military offensive against Iraq began on January 16th and 17th, 1991, with a massive U.S.-led air campaign that continued throughout the war. Over the next few weeks, this sustained aerial bombardment, which had been named Operation Desert Storm, destroyed Iraq's air defenses before attacking its communication networks, government buildings, weapon plants, oil refineries, bridges, and roads. Operation Desert Saber, a massive Allied ground offensive, was launched northward from northeastern Saudi Arabia into Kuwait and southern Iraq on February 24th, and within 3 days U.S. forces had retaken Kuwait and by February 27th had destroyed most of Iraq's elite Republican Guard units. On February 28th, U.S. President George Bush declared a ceasefire as Iraqi resistance had completely collapsed. Estimates of the number of Iraqi troops involved ranged from 180,000 to 630,000, and estimates of Iraqi military deaths ranged from 8,000 to 100,000. The Allies, by contrast, lost 292 soldiers in the conflict. The attacks against the United States on September 11, 2001, along with continued terrorist threats and attacks, have called the United States military into service once again to protect the freedoms we hold dear. Our brave soldiers are in harm's way right now, protecting us from those who would otherwise take our freedoms away and destroy our way of life. We invite you to take time not only on Veterans Day, but every day to thank a veteran for their service and sacrifice in protecting our freedoms. In addition to our veterans, also take time to remember those brave soldiers who gave the ultimate sacrifice and never made it home.